The separatist Parti Quebecois returns to power in the Canadian province of Quebec. But is Pauline Marois's victory more about anger at the previous government than separation from Ottawa? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. After a decade on the sidelines, the separatist Parti Quebecois is back in power. In her victory speech, leader Pauline Marois stuck to her separatist agenda, saying, quote, "The future of Quebec is to become its own country." But whether she'll realise that dream in the near future is another matter. The PQ fell short of the 63 seats it needs to form a majority government, leaving it forced to find coalition partners in Quebec's National Assembly. The night was marred by a fatal shooting after an apparently Anglophone protester broke into the celebration party and opened fire, killing one person. After the result, the outgoing premier, the Liberals' Jean Charest, stepped down from his party's leadership. Some argue Tuesday's result was more of a rejection of his policies than an endorsement of the Parti Quebecois. The PQ's victory comes after months of mass student protests across Quebec over the Liberal Party's hike in tuition fees. Another source of anger was new legislation that restricted the right to protest, known as Law 78. Pauline Marois has already vowed to reverse both laws. With full sovereignty likely to be on the back burner for a while, it's thought Marois will instead pursue more devolution from the federal government in Ottawa. And that may represent a challenge to Canada's Conservative Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, whose government has been accused of showing indifference to Quebec. Well, earlier I spoke with Martine Desjardins, a leader of one of the main student movements in Montreal. I asked her if she thought the PQ's victory could in part be attributed to the student protests.
Well, actually, we're very pleased about the result. We're now having the cancellation of the tuition fee hikes, and also the new government is proposing to cancel as well the Bill 12. Who was targeting actually the liberty of expression.
So the fight is over?
Well, the fight is over for now, actually, against the tuition fee hikes, because we now have exactly what we wanted for 2 years now and what we asked for. But for sure, there's another steps going forward. There will be a summit, there will be a general states coming up. And in this particular summit, the tuition fee issue will also be asked. And so we need to get prepared for this. But also we're going to talk about management of university, financial aid program. This is very important. And right now, the financial aid program doesn't cope with all the new tuition fee hikes that we've been having for the last 5 years. And so there's a lot of problems, and we need to address those issues before actually we go further for the education system, our university system. So there's a lot of new problems that we can now address, and we didn't have time to address in the past years. And so this is very enthusiastic to see that we can go forward and we can do something else for our students and advocating for the rights of the members of our federation.
It is interesting, though, that Quebec students still pay less than other students in Canada, and yet students in other provinces don't rise up. Why do you think that is? Are you in step with the rest of the country?
Well, I think we are, and this is maybe because 40 years ago we settled down and sit with the government and all the community union, and we thought about what we wanted for education, and at that time we actually choose the tuition fee freeze for the years to come, going for free education. And in the other provinces, they were hiking and much more actually their tuition fee. And the problem is why the other provinces are not going the same way and following the path that the provinces of Quebec made. And actually a lot of student unions are very concerned about what we did and are looking at us and saying, well, maybe we can try this a little bit.
So what drove the Parti Quebecois to victory in Quebec? With us to discuss that is journalist and filmmaker Francine Pelletier in Montreal. From Toronto, Tom Walkom, political columnist for the Toronto Star, and David Biette, director of the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Centre here in Washington, D.C. Tom Walkom, first of all, what was this election about?
Well, it was about a couple of things. It was, I think, mainly about whether Quebecers wanted to continue with what seemed to be a very tired, old government. And what was interesting about the results is not that the Liberals lost, the incumbent government lost, but that they didn't lose that badly. I don't think, and Francine may disagree with me, but I don't think it was an election about separatism, about sovereignty.
Francine, do you disagree?
No, not at all. It wasn't about sovereignty. It was very much about the students, though. Everyone, I think, here would say that there would, Jean Charest, the former premier, would not have called an election at this time if it hadn't been for what we call our Maple Spring, the student uprising that lasted until the election. That very much heated things up here. So that was one of the main issues, and of course the whole idea of corruption that has been, tarnishing the former Liberal government was very much an issue as well.
Having said that, though, David, as Tom mentioned, it was a very narrow victory. It is a minority government. The arch-conservative Conrad Black is hailing the result, hailing the artistic and subtle electorate of Quebec, calling Pauline Marois politically a prisoner in her own body. That doesn't sound very promising then for those who want a more liberal or at least a more progressive policy.
It's not even a third of the vote that the Parti Quebecois got, and the Liberals were not even a full percentage point behind. So it's not a mandate, and she's going to be trapped in what she wants to do. She needs a majority to get something through, and where's she going to get her support, particularly on the more difficult questions?
But already she has pledged to act rather swiftly on that issue of tuition fees and the Bill 78 on Assembly. Is there any doubt, Tom, that she can strike those laws down by decree?
Well, she can, as I understand it, she can strike the tuition fee hike down by decree, i.e. not bringing it to the legislature, just doing it as a government action. But to reverse the law, she will have to get a majority in the National Assembly. And that means that she will have to get enough other members from other parties to agree with her. So I'm not sure that it's going to be that easy for her to reverse Law 78 in the near future.
Francine, then, let's talk.
Well, that's what.
Go ahead.
Well, while that's true, I think Madame Marois was wise to step up to the plate and say this would be her first action. The thing is, the student uprising became a very popular uprising during the last months, precisely when Jean Charest enacted Bill 78, also called Bill 12. People really, really dislike that law, feel it is an unjust law, it goes much farther than it needed to. And therefore, I think Pauline Marois knows that even if the opposition parties, the Liberal parties and the new coalition party, they'll probably hold their nose and vote with her because they know that the popular vote is on her side here.
And I suppose actually, they aren't in a great position having lost their leader, the Liberals anyway, and so forth. Does anyone actually want to fight right now? Tom, I think you're about to speak.
Exactly.
I'm sorry. I'm from looking at this from Toronto, so I'm not on the ground like Francine is. But my sense from the results is that Bill 78, Law 78, wasn't universally unpopular. Jean Charest called the election on it, and he almost won the election. And there's all kinds of reasons why he shouldn't have won the election. So I'm not convinced that there is a huge majority of the population in Quebec who want to get rid of that. Who want to get rid of that law. And in that sense,
well, I think you have to make the distinction.
I don't know how much maneuvering room Pauline Marois has.
Francine?
We agree that she doesn't have a lot of maneuvering power. She, this was very much a vote against Jean Charest. It wasn't a vote for Pauline Marois. Everyone agrees about that. On the other hand, Pauline Marois, I think people were for Jean Charest and his hike, the student hike, but Bill 78 was itself unpopular. That's where the divide is. And I think it'll be interesting to see just how the opposition parties side on this one. I don't think they want to go back to those months of unrest and uprising with nightly demonstrations. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. But for sure, Pauline Marois does not have a strong mandate, and she definitely does not have a mandate for sovereignty.
David, you wanted to go?
I was just saying, we're going to split the difference here, because I think a lot of people who might have not supported the students, and again, when Law 78 came in, they said, well, this is it. This goes too far. I may not support the students, but I definitely do not support Law 78.
Okay, well, let's talk about the students and the protests. Francine, perhaps you can contextualize these protests a bit more. It is called, as you say, the Maple Spring. So was this really just about tuition hikes, or this particular tuition hike, or was it about wider social and political principles?
Well, it started off by being simply about the hike in tuition fees, a very banal issue which most people didn't care much about. And I think most people would have said, well, yes, we do pay less here, and then in the rest of North America, let alone Canada, why not, have a slight hike? But it quickly became something else. And the reason for that, first of all, was Jean Charest's obstinacy. He didn't want to sit down and talk to the students at all. There was no negotiation with the students. And that riled the students up. And as they say themselves, they started discovering themselves in the process. They started becoming far more political. And quickly they started bringing, it widened from simply a question of hikes to the question of how we deal with education. And you have to remember that in Quebec, and this is where Quebec is very, very on its own, a very distinct society. It's not like any other province because of the so-called Quiet Revolution in the 60s, where education was the first thing that managed to change the province. The idea of free education became the way that Quebec modernized itself and went from being had the highest illiteracy rate to one of the lowest, and really transformed itself. So education is a very sensitive issue. And then, of course, they added onto that with what we are doing with our natural resources. We have lots of mining going on in Quebec. There's a big plan, the Charest plan in the north. All these things were brought to the fore. And suddenly we were talking not just about one puny little issue, but about a whole social project, if you will.
And Tom, then from Toronto, then, what is the view from Toronto? Is this movement being seen as a strong oppositional force, a major political force in Quebec? And is there any thought about it having a wider potential across the country?
Well, I agree with Francine that the situation in Quebec is different from that of the rest of the country, the rest of Canada. In my sense of the student revolt in Quebec was that it, as Francine says, quickly became about something bigger. It became about, I'd call it, I guess, an implicit social contract, that there is some kind of obligation that the state has to people, or that people have to one another. And that kind of social contract used to exist in the rest of this country, but it's been pretty much beaten down. So I don't see the student revolt spreading to Ontario and to other provinces. But just to add a little rider to that, if you look at the election results, the majority of Quebecers, if you just take the student issue, and only the PQ, the Parti Quebecois, embraced the students. If you like, the majority of Quebec voters, about what, 60%, 66% or so, took the other side, took the more conservative
didn't the
side.
CAQ at least call for a moratorium on tuition hikes, though? I mean,
sorry, I didn't hear you.
Didn't the CAQ, one of the other parties, also call for a moratorium on tuition hikes, if not the full repeal? I mean, wasn't that actually, technically?
But not the full repeal. Even the Liberals at different points called for a moratorium for a certain amount of time.
All right.
But I don't know how robust. I congratulate Quebecers for fighting for the social contract that they have. I don't know how robust that fight will be in the future.
All right. So now that the PQ is in power, sovereignty, David. which nominally is the main issue. I mean, is their heart really still in it? It didn't seem to be a major issue. No one really believes that, even either during the election or in the aftermath of their victory, that they were going to push heavily for it. I mean, what role does this play now?
I think it's more generational. You have people from Pauline Marois' generation who've been around for a long time. This has been their cause for 40 years. They're grown up. They had a youth where they couldn't speak French, couldn't use their French, but young people now can use French. It's not an issue for the young people. I mean, we talked about before about this being a change in government. I don't think it was a vote for separation, except for maybe a small amount of people, a small percentage of that vote the Parti Quebecois got. But I don't think it's the issue that it was once.
We have some numbers here, some polling evidence, I guess, on attitudes towards sovereignty. When a referendum was held in 1980, 40% voted yes, with 60% voting no to sovereignty. But 1995's referendum was very close, the yes campaign getting 49.42% of the vote, the no's 50.58%. After last year's federal election, a poll, though, found 41% would vote yes and 59% no. Francine Pelletier, I mean, is this an issue anymore?
Well, you know, actually, in terms of polls, there was a poll just before the election, and I think it was at an all-time low. I think the support for sovereignty was at 28%. So David is right. So, I don't know. It's not exactly as if it was just a generational issue in the sense that young people do not care at all about this. It's as if younger people have just naturally become independent kind of people. They don't need to fight for it, as he pointed out, and their fights are much. They're more geared towards, you know, fighting for education, for the environment, for globalization, for all the more heady international questions, which also have a national impact. So at the same time, if you ask those young people if they had a chance to vote in a referendum, if they'd vote yes or no, I'm pretty sure they would vote yes. But I don't think anyone thinks we're ever going to get there anytime soon, to a time when the question will be put again. And for one good reason, apart from the polls, is that we've already, contrary to the Scots or the Catalonians, who are just thinking of having a referendum, we've already had two and lost two. And for a long time, we didn't want to admit here what a terrible, demoralizing impact that had on most people. It was a very, very tough blow, especially the last one when it was so close. So no one is ever going to hold a referendum here without being sure that it's going to be won.
Tom Walkom, I mean, we had
which will be a long time.
We had that shooting incident. I mean, we've no idea really yet what was behind it. But there was some speculation about this sort of Anglophone, French-speaking fault line. Has that kind of withered away, do you think, or has that disappeared, or is it still an issue? How's that even viewed in the rest of Canada?
You're talking about the shooting?
No, the fault line between the Anglophone and the French-speaking. I mean, the issue of separatism, the issue of language in Quebec, the issue of asymmetric federalism.
The shooter. Okay, this is a big question.
Throwing out all the big
syllable
words.
There are a lot of syllables there. I think on the shooter, the assumption is that the suspect, if indeed he was the shooter, was probably just a nut and has nothing much to do with anything else. My sense of talking to people from Quebec, my friends from Quebec, but young people from Quebec, is that the English-French fault lines that did used to exist don't particularly anymore. Anglophones, young Anglophones are perfectly bilingual, and young Anglophones are often sovereigntists. I'm on the general question of separation, I'm a little hesitant to write it off. I recall when I returned home to this country from being abroad back in, I guess it was about 1988, everyone was talking then about how separatism, as it was called then, was dead. That Quebec young people were international, that they were interested only in getting jobs, that it was passé, that it was part of an older generational thing. And then a few years later, we had the 1995 referendum in which sovereignty almost succeeded. My sense is that nationalism in Quebec is very deep. It's very deep-rooted. It expresses itself often in the desire for an independent country, and I don't think this has gone away. I think it may be in hiatus for a while, and who knows for how long.
It was notable, though, that the incoming Premier has said that she will expand Law 101, enshrining dominance of the French language, David. I mean, is that going to be a controversial point, do you think, or again?
I think it's sort of tinkering at the margins. It's sort of putting your flag down, saying we're going to deal with the language issue. Okay, getting into more small businesses, making them speak French, or not letting immigrants into English-speaking cégeps, or sort of the junior colleges, if you will. It's not a big issue, but it's planting her flag that we are paying attention to the issues. I wanted to pick up something on Tom said earlier. I mean, parts of the rest of Canada, I think, are ready to say, go to Quebec. I mean, we're tired of this discussion. We're tired of hearing this. I think people in Quebec are tired, but a lot of the others are like, look, we give so much money to you, go.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, Tom, does this? I mean, even though the PQ's separatist agenda may be, may be minimised, does this affect the national agenda in any way then, and Stephen Harper's position and the national parties and their jostling for power?
Well, there are three main national parties in Ottawa now: the Conservatives, who form the government, the Liberals, who used to be major but are now a third party, and the New Democrats, who are a social democratic party, who the official opposition. Taking them in order, I don't think this election causes any trouble for Prime Minister Stephen Harper, the Conservative Prime Minister. Pauline Marois wants a devolution of more power to the province of Quebec. The Conservatives are all in favor of the devolution of power, particularly in the area of social policy. So I think he'd be quite happy to give the Quebec National Assembly control over social programs it doesn't already fully control. The problems will of course come about who pays for it, and these are perennial in Canada. For the New Democrats, I think the election of a PQ government in Quebec potentially, and I say potentially, poses problems because the NDP has taken a very sympathetic view to Quebec's sovereignty, really, without actually coming out fully on side. As long as nobody was paying any attention to sovereignty, as long as there wasn't a sovereigntist government in Quebec City, that didn't matter in the rest of Canada. Now there is, and I think potential New Democrat supporters in other provinces will begin to look at the NDP more carefully and say, hey, aren't you giving a bit too much to Quebec? Finally, and I know this is a long answer, I apologize, I think for the Liberals, I think this actually gives them an opportunity because the Liberals have had nothing to do for the last 30 or 40 years except push national unity. And even though a referendum isn't on the table, the fact that the PQ is back in power allows the Liberals to at least say, hey, we're relevant.
All right, Francine Pelletier, we've only got a few minutes left. One other thing, Quebec, is it likely to come back into the headlines in the near future with this Charbonneau Commission, do you think? Construction scandal that might go quite high up? I mean, what are we expecting from this? Might there be further upheaval?
Well, there would have been much more upheaval if Jean Charest was still in power because this is the thing that he wanted to avoid, and this is the thing that it took him 2 years to agree to. So the Liberals are going to be tarred and
feathered. But how big a scandal? Can you quickly just sketch it out for us?
Well, it's hard to know because we don't really have all the facts, but there is a lot in the construction industry. There is a lot of corruption going on and collusion going on, but it also will tarnish the Parti Quebecois. And so everyone is holding on to see just what's going to happen. So it will attract attention, but less if the Liberals had still been in power.
David, one other point then. You say the parts of the rest of Canada say, like Quebec, we've had enough. But why is it, though, that there aren't any similar movements? I mean, there is a lot of disgruntlement with Stephen Harper on a range of issues. I mean, there's this huge swing to the right. When you talk to US Liberals about Canada, they kind of roll their eyes and say, what happened to Canada? How did it become so right-wing? But why haven't there been similar kind of Occupy-type protests across Canada, as we've seen in Quebec, do you think?
Well, there have been, not quite as big as the student movement there, but right now, the West is in. Prime Minister Harper is from the West, and they've been fighting for a long time, and now it's a Western government, and Alberta is more like the United States than any other province in Canada. And they've got more conservative ministers and members of parliament, and they're getting their way. They have a majority.
But Harper's position is safe. I mean, his polling numbers aren't great, but the opposition can't get itself together.
Exactly. As Tom was saying, the Liberals don't have a leader right now. The NDP, depending on what they say, they're the opposition now in Quebec. I mean, they got a lot of polling there, but they were a change party. Another change party could come along. All the votes could go to the Bloc Québécois next time.
All right, fascinating stuff. David Biette, thank you very much. Francine Pelletier, thank you. Tom Walkom, thank you as well.
Thank you.
And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program.